This video will go over the reasons for the Union victory chart. The picture here at the top commemorates the surrender by Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Here you see Lee surrendering to Grant. That day was Palm Sunday, which celebrates the entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem. So the caption of the drawing here at the bottom mentions how both events, the original Palm Sunday and the surrender by Robert E. Lee on Palm Sunday in 1865, brought freedom in their own distinct ways. The first factor on the chart would be the greater production of the Union. The North was where the manufacturing was. The South was predominantly agricultural. This meant that the Union had more people and more supplies for their troops, and Confederate General Robert E. Lee was aware of this. In the letter explaining his surrender to his subordinates, he wrote that the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. Let's unpack that statement. First, the free population of the Union was 21 million. That of the South was 5.5 million. The North had almost 4 times as many free citizens. This meant that the pool of men of fighting age who could be drafted into their army was much bigger for the Union. The second factor was manufacturing. The Union had 10 times the dollar value of manufactured goods. In other words, the production of all the factories in the North was 10 times what the value of the production of all the factories in the South was. This meant that the Union would not only have more soldiers, but also more weapons, uniforms, food, and other supplies. Additionally, the Union had 38 times the coal production of the South. Now we tend to look at coal as a dirty fuel, and we hope to get fuel from other sources nowadays. But back then, coal was what powered factories. If you wanted a factory in the 1800s, it had to run on coal, or you wouldn't have a factory running at all. It was definitely needed for industry, and the Union had a lot more of that coal. The Union also had twice as much railroad track, and their navy was 25 times bigger. The second factor in the Union victory was the Anaconda Plan. Now, the Anaconda Plan was the brainchild of the Union General, the Chief of Staff, Winfield Scott. Thus the heading here on this drawing, Scott's Great Snake. The Anaconda Plan had 2 parts. The first was the seizing of the Mississippi River. The head of the snake here is looking down the Mississippi River. The Union military took gunboats down the river and captured Confederate forts along the river. Seizing the Mississippi would allow the Union Army to move up and down the river at will, moving troops and supplies anywhere they wanted, and of course preventing the Confederate forces from doing the same. The second part of the Anaconda Plan was a blockade of Confederate ports. If you look at the snake's body, you can see little ships here. And that stands for the Union ships that would keep the Confederate ships from being able to export cotton to its customers and then make money doing that. Also, those Union ships kept foreign aid from England and France from coming into the Confederacy. Now, I'm not saying that this Anaconda Plan was all that it took to defeat the Confederacy, but it did lay the foundation for the eventual defeat of the Confederacy. We Americans like to see things blow up in our war movies. Blockades are boring, but blockades can weaken an enemy over the course of a war. This is a major factor in the defeat of Germany in both World War I and World War II. And the weakening of the Confederacy slowly strangled the Southern economy and the Southern war effort. The third factor in the Union victory was AWOL Confederate forces. AWOL is a military term that means absent without leave. Now, you don't have to take my word on this one. You can listen to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. In 1864, he said, 2/3 of the Confederate forces were absent from their army, and his quote, "If 1/2 the men now absent without leave will return to duty, we can defeat the enemy." There were two primary reasons for this large number of Confederate soldiers deserting. One was lack of food. The Confederate troops themselves had little to eat, and their families back home had little to eat as well. Now, you might wonder about this. Earlier, I said that the slave state South was agricultural. Well, if the South was agricultural, how could the South lack food? This opens up one of the supreme ironies of the war. Many of these slave-owning planters in the South would not plant food, but cotton and other staple crops. And this was why the Confederate Army sometimes didn't have much food. How could this be? Well, it happened because of the narrow self-interest of the planters. If these slave-owning planters grew food like corn or wheat, the Confederate Army would show up and confiscate the crops for their own Confederate Army. The most the Confederate planters would get out of that would be worthless bonds issued by the Confederacy. But if the same planters would grow cotton or tobacco, the Confederate Army would leave them alone, because you can't eat cotton or shoot cotton bullets. And this explains why these Confederate planters would grow cotton or other staple crops. When the Union Army marched into the cities of Atlanta and Savannah in Georgia, during Sherman's march, they found millions of pounds of cotton waiting to be shipped out and exported. Robert Toombs, who for a short while was the Secretary of State for the Confederacy, was condemned by the local Committee of Public Safety in his county for growing cotton and not food. Now, the fourth factor in the Union victory was the willingness of Union General Grant to carry the fight to the enemy. Grant wasn't made Commander-in-Chief of the Union Army until 1864. Before that, the Union generals were very slow to take the fight to the enemy. Lincoln was pulling his hair out trying to get Union commanders to attack. One example of this is after the defeat of the Confederate Army at Gettysburg in July 1863. Robert E. Lee's army had run out of ammunition, which is why they retreated. They limped back from Pennsylvania to Virginia. It wasn't until 2 full weeks after the battle that the Union commander at Gettysburg, General Meade, launched a full-scale pursuit of Lee, but by that time, Lee had made it back safely to Virginia. Lincoln was writing General Meade telling him that if we could capture Lee's army now before they made it back to their home base, the war could end much sooner, instead of allowing Lee to get back and resupply his army. Well, General Grant needed no such prompting. He was always ready to go on the offensive. He planned the successful campaigns of 1864 and 1865 that finally managed to surround Robert E. Lee and make him surrender. In the first week of fighting in the 1864 campaign, Grant's army took heavy casualties. Reporters asked him if he was going to take time to resupply his army. He said he could fight like that all summer long, and he kept on fighting until the victory was his.